Today's classic interview is with Jackson Katz. We talked about gender in American politics and news reporting. We have talked a lot over the last couple of years about issues related to gender. We've talked about so-called men's rights movements. We've talked about the impact of gender on politics and on elections. And as we are getting closer and closer to our next election, I thought it would be great to go back to this great conversation we had with Jackson Katz all the way back in 2011. This is 2 studios ago. So this was not at the Greenfield, Massachusetts studio. It was at the Northampton, Massachusetts studio, a ways back, but still a very relevant conversation with Jackson Katz. Let's check it out. All right, Jackson Katz is here, anti-sexist activist, author, and expert on violence, media, and masculinity. Also somebody that I know from taking classes with Sut Jolly and having him show all sorts of different documentaries. He made you somewhat, I don't know if I'd say a star, but a well-known figure at the University of Massachusetts. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I've been reading a lot of your Huffington Post stuff. I've been looking at some of the topics from your upcoming book, and I'm interested to talk. Your expertise covers a broad range of specific areas we could focus on, but I'd love to talk about the presidency, the Tea Party, the 2012 election, and kind of where you see gender, masculinity fitting in there. But to get into that, it might be good to step back and say, over the last 10, 15 years, what has been the role of gender in politics, elections, kind of as an overall picture?
Well, sure. Well, when most people hear the word gender and politics together, they assume that it's a discussion about women and women's political choices or women's voting patterns or women as candidates. And of course, those are all important issues. But the focus of my work has been on looking at how men are gendered beings and how men's political choices and men as candidates are gendered as well. And that's a discourse that I think is incredibly important in American politics and presidential politics specifically that rarely gets discussed. And so the lens that I use, if you will, to look at the last 30, 40, 50, 100 years of American politics, certainly in the media era, is the gendered lens looking at men and masculinity. And my basic point is that gender is always an issue in presidential politics. It's always an issue. But only when a woman is running, like when Hillary Clinton was running for the Democratic nomination in 2008, do people actually talk about gender. But even when 2 men are running against each other, gender is a central force in presidential politics.
And it's just interesting you mentioned, usually when someone says gender, you're thinking of women. And I think this applies when there's discussions of race. I think people's minds go to either black people or brown people, Hispanic people, what have you. When there's a discussion of class, your thought goes to poor people.
Right. Well, what you're describing is how dominance functions by stealth or invisibility. And so making visible what has been rendered invisible is one of the most, I think, important progressive projects, whether it's in politics about racism or heterosexism or sexism. Making the dominant group visible and examining the mechanisms by which it maintains its dominance is a key, it's a key act of, progressive transformation. Even issues as ranging as prostitution and sex trafficking. It's looking at instead of looking at the supply side, like the prostitutes, you look at the demand side. The demand side meaning men who are buying sex. This is all of this is about shifting focus off of the subordinated groups or the oppressed, if you will, groups, and looking critically at the dominant group and how it maintains its privilege.
So to be really specific, when we think back to the 2008 election, after it became clear that Hillary Clinton was not going to be the Democratic nominee, John McCain, Barack Obama, 2 men, for not 2 white men for once, so that was something a little bit different to start with. Let's be specific about how gender was a factor. I mean, I think many people who will see this will say, okay, I get what you're saying, that when someone says gender, you're thinking of women, and the fact that the 2 of them are men is also important. How is it a factor? What questions aren't being asked? What aren't we seeing in the media? Let's get into it.
Sure. Well, the first thing I think that I look at in my work, and I think it's really fundamental and basic, is that there is a persistent gender gap in voting patterns in the United States, and among white men in particular. White men have been voting radically disproportionately for the Republican nominee for president for the last 40 years. And in working class white men, there's different ways of defining working class, but with a high school education, men with a high school education voted in 2000 for George Bush by something like 27 points over Al Gore. And Kerry, about 25% voted for Bush over Kerry in 2004. Barack Obama cut into that pretty significantly in 2008, although he still lost the white men's vote.
That's right.
But he lost it by like about 16 percentage points. So he made some significant inroads into the white men's vote. But if you look at white male voting patterns, the only way the Democrat can win at the national level in the presidency is if they win such a dramatic percentage of the women's vote that it offsets their deficit among the white male vote.
That's right.
And so how can we not talk about gender? Why are white men so dramatically voting for the Republican candidate for president? Now, some people, of course, since the Civil Rights Act, have been talking about race as one of the central forces subtextually at work in presidential politics.
And it's being talked about looking forward also because of the increasing Hispanic population and how that will play a factor. That's
right. And of course, Obama being an African-American, that brought to the surface a lot of discussions about race and politics and such that had always been there, but they were talked about even more explicitly. Would white people vote for an African-American for president, et cetera? My thinking is that it's not just that white men are voting as a racialized bloc for the Republican candidate, although that's a big part of it. They're also voting in a gender sense as men, because especially since the late 60s and early 70s, and then increasingly after the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan, the way that the two-party system has been sort of shaken out, if you will, in the gender binary is the Republican Party is the party of real men,
right,
and the Democratic Party is the party of women and feminized men. And that has heterosexist implications as well,
sure,
because the Democratic Party is seen as the party of gay rights, if you will, in addition to the men in the Democratic Party feminized in the national discourse. And I think this is a cultural political analysis, right? I think that this is an incredibly important reason why lots of white men, including working and middle-class white men, vote against their economic interests, at least as some of us understand those economic interests.
No question about it.
Right. So this complicates the analysis of, say, Thomas Frank and others who have been trying to figure out why so many Americans, especially white Americans, have voted against their economic interests for the past generation.
You mentioned the issue of gay rights, and we saw that really incredibly directly and just at the forefront in the discussion of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I mean, I interviewed people who said the reason we shouldn't have homosexuals serving openly in the military is because the American military is manly. And implicit in that, even though it's not discussed, is that there's something bad about femininity and women in the military. And when I challenged some of those people directly, it was made very clear that that is involved in that subtext, just barely underneath the surface. But other than that particular issue, what else is it that has driven this white male voting bloc towards the Republican candidate?
In my book that I'm working on and just about to complete, I look at 3 issues. There's so many issues, and so you have to really narrow it. But
or the major ones,
yes,
maybe.
Yeah, sure. I looked at 3 issues that all involve violence, and they all involve important political issues over the past 40, 50 years. The first one is the Cold War. The second one is the rise of street crime as a domestic political issue in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. And the discussion about violent crime, street crime, has a definitely racialized undertone to it. And then the rise of terrorism as a political issue in the late 20th century and into the 21st century. All 3 of those issues, Cold War, domestic crime, and terrorism, have to do with violence. And the president is a stand-in a certain sense, the symbolic leader of the country. He embodies, if you will, the national masculinity in a very important sense. People talk about the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the mourner-in-chief when national tragedy happens, the first family. He's the one who everybody salutes to and everybody stands when he enters the room. He really does, in a certain sense, represent the country.
And how can we prove that it's a gender thing? Because 2 of those 3 issues you mentioned, just at a very superficial analysis, to me feel like they are race issues. I mean, terrorism, we think of Muslims as the picture that's being painted, right?
Yep.
And street crime, black people for sure, and we see that
yes,
black people are incarcerated at much higher levels, percentage-wise. So sell the idea that it is actually gendered in there somewhere.
Okay. Well, no, I appreciate your point here. It's a racialized gender analysis.
Okay.
So it's not. I'm not saying it's one or the other.
Sure.
I'm saying that let's add gender to our understanding of what have been understood as racialized issues. So, for example, the street crime issue, which emerged in the 1960s and 1970s as an important political issue that the right really ran with, if you will. If you listen to the kind of rhetoric that was thrown at Democrats and liberals and progressives about crime, it was things like you're soft on crime, you're coddling criminals. Who coddles somebody in the real world?
Mothers.
Mothers coddle babies, right? So in other words, it's feminizing. In other words, what we need is a tough man, a tough white man in that racially subtextual sense, to get tough with these African-American rioters and criminals. And the liberals are a bunch of wimps and wusses and feminized men who aren't up to that task. That's an example of a gendered racial subtext. And terrorism is similar. Tough on terrorism versus soft on terrorism. And it's amazing how the Republican Party has been able to frame the Democratic Party, which includes a lot kinds of guys who are veterans like John Kerry, who had actually proven, quote unquote, their valor in war in ways that some of the Republican candidates like George W. Bush haven't. In spite of that real world record, they've been able to feminize these men. And in part, by the way, the Kerry piece was he was feminized in a class sense because of his class baggage, if you will. And for example, the picture of him what's the word? Skiing on the...
He was windsurfing
off of like Nantucket or something. Yeah. While his advisors might have thought that made him look athletic and made him look robust.
The elitist.
The read is elitist. And by the way, even the term elitist is a gendered term. It's one of the ways that wealthy men have been feminized by a certain working class discourse.
Sure.
As a way of saying that they might have money, they might have more status, and in an abstract sense, they might have more power, but they're kind of wusses. They're kind of not really manly. There's an anti-intellectualism that runs deep in American culture, and Richard Hofstadter's book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, published in, I think, 1964, I think it's currently applicable today. It's a brilliant analysis of the roots of anti-intellectualism, but anti-intellectualism has a gendered tone because in male culture, intellectual achievement is often seen as, when I say male culture, I'm talking about like sort of sports bar kind of guy culture, kind of the mainstream, sort of guy culture. Intellectual attainment and polysyllabic speech is gendered feminine. Like, guys don't talk like that. So look at George W. Bush. I mean, downplaying his aristocratic roots, downplaying his Ivy League education, affecting a Texas blue-collar swagger, and being seen, therefore, somehow as more authentic. As a guy who you could relate to, as then say somebody like John Kerry, who's much more erudite, who's much more intellectual and cerebral. Al Gore, another example. I mean, so this is how it plays out in a cultural, political way. The elitism as sort of masculine effeminacy.
Can we talk a little bit about Sarah Palin specifically, and if we include Michelle Bachmann or Christine O'Donnell in that, fine. Something we saw a lot in the recent years has been some women's groups have criticized those who criticize Sarah Palin as saying that what's behind the criticism is that Sarah Palin is a woman. And it has been turned in a way that I haven't seen recently into Democrats are the ones who are against women's rights. What's your thought about that narrative and generally about what we've seen around Sarah Palin and other candidates?
Well, it's a complicated. Sarah Palin is as we would say in the academic sense, a complicated text. There's no question about it, and that's one of the reasons why she's a compelling sort of cultural figure. Yeah. However, some of us might feel about her politics. She has something. She represents something that's very interesting. And one of the things, to be honest, David, that I'm most interested in about Sarah Palin is how she's popular with a lot of white male conservative men who are sexist and traditionalist, and the idea of them supporting for president, and that now again, who knows if that's going to end up happening? She's never ran for a president, but
I don't believe it will.
Okay, but she was in that discourse, and she still is, right? The idea that a white conservative man would potentially support her for president is really notable, and I have to think, why is that? What about what Sarah Palin is saying and doing and representing would cause a white man who does a conservative, traditionalist, sexist white man or chauvinist white man to support her? And one of the things that I think is really interesting is what's going on is that she attacks liberal and progressive men's masculinity whenever she has the opportunity, which has the effect of supporting conservative men's masculinity. In other words, she boosts. Michelle Bachmann does it. Ann Coulter. That's one of the features of Ann Coulter's public life is that she goes on college campuses and elsewhere and just ridicules progressive and liberal men. And the young conservative guys are eating it up because what she's basically saying is those guys who disagree with you, those guys who stand with the feminists and stand with progressive activists, they're a bunch of neutered wimps. Real men are right-wing Republicans.
And Christine O'Donnell, we would talk about her key and choice phrases during her campaign. She actually said her male opponent needed to man up. So it was not that she was able to get in on the action too.
That's right. And Sharon Engel said something similar as well.
That's right, yeah.
There is some criticism of Sarah Palin from the left that is sexist in its nature, and I think obviously that's the tricky part, because how do you criticize her and really identify the offensive nature of some of the things that she says and believes without playing into the sexism? It's a complicated, it's a complicated task.
To take a bigger picture look in the last couple of minutes here, to you, just your opinion, is the ideal scenario one where gender would be such a non-issue when we are electing candidates or whatever that it would not even warrant discussion? I mean, is that the ideal scenario? Or no matter what, is gender on the list of whatever else is on that list, it doesn't matter, that is always worth discussion, no matter what happens in terms of the discourse in the next 20, 30, 40 years?
Well, I mean, I think one of the ways to think about that is the same way that some people would look at, do we live in a post-racial society or do we not? And I think it's obvious that we do not.
Right.
And even though we elected an African-American man president, of course, racism and race is incredibly important. And I don't see in my lifetime that it's not going to be incredibly important. And I think gender is the same thing. And maybe someday in some far distant future, gender won't be significant, but I don't think we're anywhere close to that.
But my question is, given that there are a number of different things that we can discuss about what make people different, right? Uh-huh. And we could have a long laundry list, hundreds, maybe even thousands of things. Is gender such an important one, separate from where we are today because of what's happened and all of the things that you and I have discussed so far? Is it such an inherent part of how people are different that it always warrants discussion? Or could you imagine a situation where gender is no longer something that is do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, but I think that's utopian. I think
it's completely utopian.
It's so far in the future that it's like science fiction.
Yeah.
Sophisticated thinking requires us to make intersectional observations about gender and race and class and how it's all embedded. And if we got more men and women engaged in this conversation, I think its power, that is gender's power as a dividing force, if you will, would be diminished. But I think we would have more progressive politics if there was more consciousness about how, sort of masculinity is linked to conservative ways of thinking about the world, which affects politics. If we could make that visible, it would have less power, and therefore we'd have more progressive politics.
I would take it a step further, and what we've been saying for years on the show, if we had more nuanced, cross-platform, cross-genre analysis of almost any issue, we would have more progressive politics and more progressive people. That's just my thought. Jackson Katz, anti-sexist activist, author, expert on violence, media, masculinity. Great to have you in studio today. And your website, jacksonkatz.com.
Yes. Thank you very much. It's been great to be with you.
Thanks.